In this video, we're going to be looking at the respiratory system. We will have a few videos looking at the functional anatomy of the respiratory system, and then a few more looking at the physiology of how the respiratory system works. The main function of the respiratory system is to supply the body with O2 for cellular respiration, and then to dispose of the CO2, which is a waste product of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration depends on respiration in order to occur, which makes sense. The cellular process of cellular respiration makes energy for the body so that the body's processes can function. And so that whole system is reliant upon this body system that we're going to be talking about. It is very closely coupled with the circulatory system, and we'll look at that in just a second. And it also involves our senses of smell. It also involves things like speech. And so there's a lot going on with the respiratory system. The respiratory system involves four main processes, and you can see them here on this picture here. There is pulmonary ventilation. That is the process of actually just breathing in, breathing out. And then there is external respiration, which is the exchange of CO2 and oxygen that happens in the lungs. And so when you breathe in, the blood takes in the oxygen and gets rid of the CO2. There's the transport of the respiratory gases, part 3, which you can see here on this infographic again. And that is where those oxygen is going out to the body cells, and then there is CO2 going back to the lungs. And then there is internal respiration, which is where O2 and CO2 are exchanged in the body cells. So looking at some of the anatomy of the respiratory system, first we'll look at the upper respiratory system, which involves the nose and the paranasal sinuses and a few other parts that we'll look at. This might be one of the funniest pictures that I have all year, actually. It's pretty special. Anyway, the nose is the only external portion of the respiratory system. It's the only portion of the respiratory system that you can see, which is kind of strange to think about. But the nose functions in lots of different ways. Of course, it provides an airway for respiration. It moistens and warms the air as it enters into our lungs, filters it, cleans the air. We have hairs and other things in our nose that do that. It serves as a resonating chamber for speech. And so when we make speech, the nose is very important in that. And then obviously it houses olfactory receptors, which make up our sense of smell. And the nose is divided into two regions, the external nose and the nasal cavity. We're not going to talk about the different parts of the external nose. I mean, you probably didn't even know that you had an ala and an apex. But, if you're interested in that, be interested in it. We're not going to talk a lot about it. We'll look at the nasal cavity, though. So it's found within the nose, obviously. It's external to the nose, and it's also internal. So it's kind of both. It's divided by this portion called the nasal septum. And the nasal septum is that portion that's in between the two nostrils. It is lined with tiny hairs, and those hairs filter coarse particles from the air that you're breathing in. And the rest of the nasal cavity is lined with mucous membranes to produce mucus in order to catch things that would get in there that shouldn't get in there. And there are also, here's a picture of that. So there are also these things called nasal concha, which we talked about when we talked about the skeletal system. And the purpose of the nasal concha is to provide surface area for the nose so that it can filter things, so it can heat the air and moisten the air as it goes into your lungs. I don't know if I have a picture of the paranasal sinuses. I don't. You can kind of see them here. You can definitely see the sinuses here. There's the sphenoid sinus and the ethmoid and the frontal sinus. And so the purpose of the sinuses, other than to make you feel like crap during allergy season, are to lighten your skull. So they're like holes in the skull, causes your skull to be lighter, which is nice. They also secrete mucus, again, which serves to filter particles. And again, they also help and warm and moisten the air. They also are a very important part of our speech. They can also serve in that resonating capacity. So next we'll look at the pharynx. The pharynx is this, basically the way to think about the pharynx is it is the tube where your mouth, here's the mouth. This is really strange looking mouth because here's the tongue right here. So you can kind of picture this mouth. And then here's the nasal cavity, which is probably bigger than you thought it was. And this area back in here is known as the pharynx, kind of where the nose and the mouth meet. And there are several portions of the pharynx, which you can see the three main portions there highlighted. The nasopharynx, which, is up here posterior to the nasal cavity, and also involves this area here called the soft palate. It's like in the back of your mouth, and that little thing called the uvula that is in the back of your mouth. And the soft palate and the uvula close this portion of the nasopharynx when you swallow, keep things from going up into your nose. You also have these organs up here that are called the pharyngeal tonsil, but you've probably heard them called the adenoids or the adenoids. They are part of your tonsils, and a lot of times if you have your tonsils removed, they'll also remove your adenoids, and we'll talk more about those in just a second. And they also have the pharyngotympanic tubes, which you can see here, the pharyngotympanic tube, and there's another one. If this face was cut or looking at it turned the other way, you would see the other one. And just look at that. Pharynx and tympanic means ear. And so this is the canal that goes from your pharynx to your eardrum. And so there is a connection between those. Sometimes you'll see these called the eustachian canals, same sort of thing. And their purpose is to equalize pressure but in the middle ear. So they kind of relieve that pressure. If you've ever had an ear infection, that those tubes are trapped and that pressure can't equalize, and it's pretty painful. Next is the oropharynx. This is the passageway for food and air, and that goes back here. Oro means mouth, so this is kind of the mouth part of the pharynx. And then there is the laryngopharynx, because here is the larynx, which is the voice box. We'll talk about that in the next video. And again, passageway for food and air right here in this little area, because food goes down one way, air goes down the other. And there is this structure known as the epiglottis, you can see here. And the epiglottis covers the trachea when you swallow so that food doesn't go down into your lungs, which would be bad. And so one of the things that was interesting to me as I read through this, because I, as a kid, had my adenoids removed, but not my tonsils, which was interesting. So adenoids are part of your tonsils. Remember, the tonsils are part of your lymphatic system, and they trap stuff back in there and work directly with the immune system to deal with it. But one of the imbalances that can occur with this is that they can become swollen, particularly for young children. They can block airway passages, and they can make it difficult to breathe, and especially at night if you try to breathe through your nose. And so a lot of times kids that have swollen adenoids are only able to breathe through their mouth, and they may not be able to speak or to enunciate words very well, or they may have this very nasally kind of sound. And that's not good. You need to breathe through your nose if you can, because of that warming of the air and moistening of the air. And so a lot of times people who have adenoid issues do have those speech issues and also have trouble sleeping at night. And so then what they'll do is they'll just go in and remove them. But a lot of times now, instead of just removing the adenoids, they'll just take out the adenoids and the tonsils, because they can become problems later, which, there's probably a good portion of you that have your tonsils removed just for the sake of they get a lot of those pathogens stuck in them and become infected pretty frequently.